Here is what expert in statement analysis Peter Hyatt said about this statement. This statement is highly in the negative, which increases importance for us. 1. There has been no indication. 2. There has never been any sort of threat. 3. I don't just think it is premature. Given the context and dating of the statement, including that this is a show about crime, this is a most unexpected and unnecessary statement. In any unsolved crime, the investigation is wide open. A show that is about crime knows this as well as anyone. If this was said years later, it would have likely less weakness in assertion. Why does Nick Ross have a need to so very quickly eliminate this possibility? Note that in context, a program might find the publicity, including the intrigue of a possible connection, to be invaluable publicity. If there is no connection, why would the subject have the need to ridicule with daft? The reporting of what has not happened and what he does not think is combined with the need to ridicule rather than report. The change in pronoun from we to I shows an increase in importance to the speaker himself personally. Why would he have a personal need to ridicule this? His assertion comes off as powerful, which statement analysis reveals to the contrary. It is the need to sound so persuasive itself that we find the weakness. In 2016, Nick Ross spoke about Jill Dando's murder in an hour-long interview for a series called Media Masters. I have picked out some key paragraphs and had them analysed by a professional analyst for possible deception. You can find the full analysis by following this link, but here I will present the parts relevant to the murder and some of the conclusions.
Yeah. And what was that like to have to, open a show with a reconstruction of the murder of one of your own show's presenters?
Some of the press afterwards made it sound as though Jill and I were sort of very, very close friends, which we weren't. I mean, we used to go out to dinner with our respective spouses, or in her case, fiancé every now and then. But we were colleagues. On the other hand, we were very close colleagues. We liked each other a lot.
There's been an allegation here of an inappropriate relationship with Jill and a denial. He gives a strong denial of an inappropriate relationship at that time. His use of the pronoun we, which shows unity and cooperation, confirms his claim of close colleagues. This is a truthful assertion from his perspective. It is important to note what the insinuation of the press is met with. We weren't. He then goes on to describe the relationship. His denial is simply, we weren't. He has no need to revisit it with more denials, qualifications, nor ridicule. This is a strong denial that he does not feel the need to attempt to strengthen. In contrast, compare this denial to his original denial about connection between the programme and her death. This comparison is very important because it uses its own reference point. There are two accusations or assertions here. 1, inappropriate relationship. 2, did he know or suspect that Jill was murdered due to knowledge she would not have had?
And did you get any useful leads from that show?
It was difficult, but it was also frustrating. By this stage, you've got to bear in mind, I had been doing crime watch for 15 years. When I started, I didn't have any interest in crime at all, and certainly no knowledge about crime.
This is a yes or no question. His answer is very important. He avoids answering yes or no, which now elevates the importance of this question. Next, we see that before answering the question, he shows his priority. It is not just his 15 years experience, but he has a need to communicate a very powerful and personal issue. He did not have any interest in crime at all. This must be believed by the audience before he answers the question. It is to say, I didn't want this, I don't like this, I did not choose this. It is a very powerful psychological distancing that he feels so important that it comes before the question of any leads into the murder. He immediately distances himself from the question. Next, the priority continues. I did not want this, and I had no knowledge of crime. Note the wording, certainly no knowledge about crime. He not only didn't want this, he needs to assert his own innocence of knowledge of crime. If he was in therapy, a well-trained therapist would recognize this as a protestation. The therapist would seek to uncover not only what specific knowledge of crime is bothering him so much, but why said knowledge is bothering him so much. Given the extremity of his denial of possible connection to the program, he has a need to pronounce himself highly knowledgeable so that he will be believed when he makes the denial. This itself is weakness. However, even when this setting of the stage is to be believed, his choice of wording is still personal and likely the leakage of having knowledge that he does not want to possess. It is as if to say, I know something I do not want to know. I did not ask for it. I did not want it. And I do not want it today. Therefore, I am going to wage war against it by exaggeration, ridicule, or any other means at my disposal, even if it means blaming an innocent person.
After 15 years, I had interviewed so many senior officers, so many detectives. I knew quite a bit. And one thing was pretty clear to me, is that you follow the evidence. You don't follow your hunch.
15 years of experience led him to assert only the obvious. You follow the evidence, you don't follow your hunch. He built an expectation of wisdom to follow, but offered only elementary. This is a major point of weakness. He then follows the weakness with the need to ridicule.
The Sherlock Holmes stuff was absolute Horlicks.
The need to insult should be compared to his denial of being very, very good friends above. He denied this plainly, yet the possible connection to the program, even years later, triggers a strong emotional need to persuade.
And the evidence here, right from the start, did not point to where the public clamour was pointing. The public clamour was pointing to this being a conspiracy. And everybody at first said it's because of Crime Watch.
Sensitivity is very high, as we see in the negative and the need for the lengthy sentence. Note, this is indicative of psychological closeness, and this being a conspiracy is stated without a direct quote. The reader or analyst should consider a possible embedded admission. It is the public clamour being given voice.
Well, that Jill would have presented some segment on some underworld gang lord or something that wanted to wreak revenge.
Instead of allowing the interviewee to present what conspiracy, the interviewer gives him the answer. This is a mistake. He introduces gang lord into the conversation. We do not know if this is what the subject was referencing. Whatever the subject was referencing was very important to him, and this creates a diversion. The subject now has opportunity to direct his attention to gang lord rather than anything and everything else that could have been on his mind. This is a critical error in interviewing.
Now look, you don't have to be a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society to just do a bit of maths. We haven't had any judges been murdered for sending people down. We haven't had senior investigating officers murdered for sending people down, for catching people. We haven't even had police sergeants murdered for doing, or police constables, or for that matter, PCOs since. I mean, it's not what happens in this country.
The gang lord is addressed. He gives point after point of who has not been murdered.
So the idea that a television presenter who was merely, if you like, articulating an appeal would be shot, it just didn't make sense. It didn't make statistical sense. You know that phrase that scientists know called Occam's razor, that never go for a more complicated explanation if there's a simple one. Well, everybody was going for the complicated explanations.
His argument is that if those responsible for investigating and sentencing are not targeted, why would a reporter? This is reasonable. What is at issue is twofold. One, the interviewer introduced gang lord murder, not the subject. Two, the subject used the plural, complicated explanations, whereas gang lord murder is a singular topic.
And the other things, as soon as, I knew where Jill lived. I knew that she didn't actually live there. She was staying with her boyfriend. So anybody who'd done this conspiratorially was terribly badly prepared, because it was pure chance she went there.
Recall, he gives a legitimate argument against the gang lord targeting a voice rather than an investigator. Now compare it to his offering of conspiratorially and terribly badly prepared, ridiculing the simple following the victim. Note who it is that brings this knowledge. I knew where Jill lived. I knew that she didn't actually. He knew. It is important that we note this. He knew. I knew is produced by him. It is repeated. We must consider what it is he knew and would warrant repetition and immediate change to the pronoun we.
We then found whoever had done it had been seen hanging around for a long time, was pretty stupid, didn't have a getaway vehicle, and shot Jill in a street called Gowan Avenue, which is a long, long, straight street with virtually no turn-offs. Now, come on. A professional killer
Wouldn't
having
have
to
done that.
walk away down a long street with no
It is no longer what I knew, but we, which could represent knowledge that went public. This would be an appropriate change of pronoun, and should it change back to I, it will increase importance for us. Note what follows.
There were so many other things, I'm not going to go through them all, but there were so many other things right from the beginning.
He had the need to ridicule the idea of a professional shooter, rather than give the description of an amateur. He tells us that there were so many things that I, knew about, but he is not going to go through them all. But, refute assertion, so many other things right from the beginning which point to timing. The element of time often indicates a change. This change can be a change in activity, or in context here, a change in knowledge. This is his own knowledge, I, which we expect to continue, but it doesn't.
Well, for example, when we knew she had a key in the door when she was shot.
The back and forth change from I to we is in context about knowledge. This tells us that he wishes to separate the two. There is knowledge that he has, and there is knowledge that we, the public, have. The subject himself reveals the need to separate the two. This is an indication of knowledge he does not want to share. This could be knowledge that is fact-based, or it could be acute suspicion.
But instead of pushing her inside and shooting her there to muffle the sound, he'd shot her on the doorstep, where she'd be seen, where the sound was heard.
He has the need to tell us that this was not intelligent.
Everything conspired to this not being a professional hit.
For him, after all the years of interviewing investigators, the conclusion is singular: stupidity. It cannot be, for him, that the shooter was not concerned with getting caught.
And yet in that first programme it was quite clear that the police were following, as they so often do, the public clamour.
This is a passive-aggressive insult of police. This means he does not wish to be seen as insulting to police, but holds this thought of contempt towards them. How would the many investigators he interviewed over so many years feel about this statement? He then further amplifies his answer and seeks to reduce the inherent insult by joining himself to the theme.
It was one of the many occasions when I realised that the police are not sort of forensically independent of public opinion. They are part of public opinion. They're pushed and manoeuvred by public opinion just as the rest of us are. So it was difficult.
But within a few weeks, they feel that they had their man at that point, didn't they, Barry George?
Well, no, they didn't. It wasn't a few weeks. I mean, that was the frustrating thing. There was a detective who was on the trail of Barry George. Two witnesses had rung again and again and again, saying this man was around at the time, had come to them with trying to get false alibis thereafter, was behaving very, very oddly, and they must look at him. They were really concerned so much they kept ringing back. But the team, including when they had reviews from Scotland Yard, kept going after the conspiracy theories. So this detective knew, but he was basically put off. And it was a year after every other lead had gone into the sand. It was a year later that they went back to this.
This is a claim that the crime would have been solved by a detective with the murderer being Barry George, except that this detective, unnamed, was put off from following the evidence. Note that this putting off is declared to be basically. He reduces the commitment to this assertion by adding in basically and weakens it psychologically, bringing the detective close to him, this detective, but not naming him.
And when Barry George was convicted, you clearly thought justice was done. Was it frustrating to see him cleared?
First his assumption, then his question based upon his own assumption.
It was astonishing to see him convicted. I mean, I'll be honest about that. I thought that the evidence against him was very compelling indeed, As long as you think of evidence not in the way that an English court thinks of evidence.
He is declaring that he is not honest about some things and honest about other things. If the evidence was very compelling, what caused this astonishment? Instead of asking this question, the interviewer offers an answer.
What insofar as it was largely circumstantial, there was no...
Exactly.
No need for an explanation. It was given to the subject, who accepted it plainly. The interviewer furthers his own assumption.
Overwhelming mass of circumstantial evidence.
Overwhelming evidence of things where the arrows pointed at his guilt.
This is the assertion of the interviewer. He then moves to a rhetorical.
And they had just one particle, didn't they?
Well, that was the frustrating, really irritating thing, actually. The Crown Prosecution Service, people have got so used to forensic evidence, which, of course, we virtually didn't have for most of the last century. But now, unless there's forensic evidence, Crown Prosecution Service is often very, very reluctant to prosecute. And so they wouldn't unless there was some evidence. They found this ridiculous little speck of firearms discharge residue in one of his pockets.
Please note that firearms discharge residue is considered solid evidence in a gun murder.
Because this will have been a year later by the time he was arrested.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it may have been relevant, may not have been relevant, but even at the time, I was hoping they wouldn't present it, because I thought it would just divert from all the other stuff.
The subject, with 15 years' experience in dealing with crime and investigators, reduces evidence in a murder case of a close colleague to stuff. What caused him to call evidence stuff? What was all that he was not going to go into earlier? What has he offered as circumstantial evidence thus far? He has only offered what a professional murderer would not do.
Did you consider leaving the show after Jill passed away?
No, never, because firmly I never believed it was anything to do with Crime Watch. And I've always rejected the conspiracy theories.
No was a good answer. Instead, he goes on to never, which now weakens the denial of no. He weakens it further with the need to explain why. This is seen in the word because in his answer. Next, the reason is given in the negative with the repetition of the word never, in never believed it was anything to do with Crime Watch. He is not done weakening the denial. He goes even further.
And I've always rejected the conspiracy theories.
He does not believe his own words. Note that he has always rejected the conspiracy theories, with rejected meaning refused to accept. Also note that theories is plural, meaning for him it is not just one. Had he said no without the need to persuade, it would have been much stronger. Instead, he goes into the negative, repetition and unnecessary explanation to indicate such extreme sensitivity that it belies his denial. Consider his measured response to the press, saying they were very, very good friends, and compare it to this topic. One topic produces a denial that is strong enough to stand on its own. The other denial shows a desperate need to persuade. He shows a vast difference in his language between the two denials. The more need to call in reinforcements, the weaker the denial.
And I happen to know about the most ludicrous conspiracy theory of all. I mean, it's almost infantile.
Not only do we have further ridicule, most ludicrous indicates his belief that others are also ludicrous, but he uses the word infantile. It should be noted that while in this defensive posture, he has called upon the word infantile. Here he now introduces new material to the interview. After ridicule, the topic introduced is important to the subject.
It's risible, and yet it was actually used seriously in the Old Bailey. And this was that it was to do with the Yugoslav war.
The subject introduces Yugoslav war. Because he introduced it, it is important to him and to us.
And I'll tell you how this story came about. Alison Lewis was Jill's great confidant. She was her agent. She was a friend of mine. I know Alison, you knew Alison well. Alison had been asked by the police who'd got anything against Jill. She couldn't think of anything. Weeks later, it occurred to her, we had a letter from somebody. It wasn't a green ink letter. It was a sort of, I don't think you were very fair in that appeal about Yugoslavia, because the Serbs had been victims as well.
The Yugoslav war is introduced. Alison Lewis is introduced. Serbs are introduced. These topics are important enough for him to not only introduce, but to stress the relationship that he had and has with Jill's great confidant, Alison Lewis. He repeats his "I know" phrase, and in its own repetition he adds, "I knew Alison well."
And she mentioned this to her boss. He got quite excited about it and told it to some journalists. And all of a sudden this story emerged that, Slobodan Milosevic, in the middle of a civil war hundreds and hundreds of miles away, had decided this civil war could be resolved by going and shooting an English television presenter.
He introduces Slobodan Milosevic in the interview. This is done while classifying Alison Lewis's boss without name, but as one being quite excited about this information. Why the need to classify as such? Next note, hundreds of miles away, is added to the description. The interviewer, always ingratiating, quickly agrees.
Insane.
For a theory to be insane, that's the interviewer's language, but be the most ludicrous of all the conspiracy theories, he devotes the most amount of words to, even more than the words used to describe the deceased. I've also included some of Peter's conclusions. Nick Ross is not honestly reporting his knowledge/belief about the Jill Dando murder. Ross exhibits guilt regarding what he knows about the murder. It is a powerful emotion that causes him the need to ridicule any possible connection of the programme to Jill's murder. What is very difficult to discern between is guilty knowledge versus acute suspicion. Nick Ross is withholding information in the interview about the murder of Jill Dando. Is this information knowledge about the motive of the murder? Is it acute suspicion of the motive of the murder? To know with precision, more sample is needed. Does he feel responsible for any possible exposure to information? With Nick Ross, very high emotions are provoked within him with the topic of connecting the murder to the programme. He introduced the Yugoslav Civil War with the need of promoting any connection as absurd. Investigative journalist Richard Hall presented this transcript for analysis with the question of whether it is possible that Jill Dando died as a result of coming into contact with sensitive information via the programme, as seen only in the language of Nick Ross. Peter concludes it is. There is language consistent with protecting very sensitive withheld information within Nick Ross's interview. That Nick Ross knows more than he is stating here is evident. Whether it is factual knowledge or acute suspicion is not known with precision. Even with approximately 16 years of processing, he does not show significant progress from his statement made shortly after the murder. This is a critical need to dismiss and ridicule, and the repeated protestations made years later only strengthen the original analysis. 16 years did not weaken his stance. That he knows or suspects Jill's murder is related somehow to her position at Crime Watch remains strong. Whether she was told, read, or was exposed to information regarding the possible tie with political terrorism, any of these could produce guilt within Nick Ross. His friendship with her was reliably reported. It is this international connection, not Yugoslav specific, but international specific, that warrants exploration. Now, I would just like to add my own comment here at the end of Peter's analysis that the appeal Jill made about Kosovo, which I will show later, was not connected to Crime Watch. Therefore, there is no reason why Ross should feel guilty if the killer was a Kosovan hitman. In my opinion, there is a different reason for his guilt, and as the analysis shows, that reason is probably connected to Crime Watch. I want now to look at the police investigation and highlight some evidence which I believe suggests that the police were never trying to solve this case from the start. An interesting statement about the police investigation on Wikipedia reads, "The original police investigation had explored the possibility of a contract killing, but since Dando was living with her fiancé and was only rarely visiting her Gowan Avenue house, it was considered unlikely that a professional assassin would have been sufficiently well informed about Dando's movements to have known at what time she was going to be there." Also, according to police, analysis of road CCTV cameras show that she was not followed by car to her address. But hang on, It all depends on who hired the contract assassin, does it not? If the assassin was hired by the security services, which would likely be through a third party to give plausible deniability, then a professional assassin would be given sufficient information about Dando's movements. After all, this is what security services do for a living: covertly gather information on people through a plethora of avenues available to them. A simple tap on her phone would suffice. If anyone wanted to find out Jill Dando's movements, certainly MI5 could. You might recall from my last Madeleine McCann film and lecture me talking about Sky News' Martin Brunt and about how I am convinced that he is an MI5 asset. Follow this link for details of this. I picked up this quote from the book Jill Dando, Her Life and Death by Brian Cathcart. Among crime correspondents who had picked up the rumour before 1 p.m. was Martin Brunt of Sky News. He had received confirmation that Dando had definitely been attacked, that it was not an accident. This came not from an official Scotland Yard spokesman, but from a police source whom Brunt could not identify on air. She was only pronounced dead at 3 minutes past 1. Was he tipped off by MI5? The man who was put in charge of the investigation was Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell, working out of the notorious Belgravia police station, which is known for running intelligence cover-up operations. I've mentioned it before in relation to the London bombings and the Madeleine McCann case.
A man was seen leaving from outside number 29 Gowan Avenue, and he ran east down this road towards the Fulham Palace Road. A man between late 30s and 40s, white. He was carrying a mobile phone, he was clean-shaven, and he had dark hair. The witnesses describe him as being well-groomed, possibly wearing a jacket or a suit. And anybody who knows that man or anybody else who saw that person out there, we would like to speak to.
Campbell had been a frequent guest on BBC's Crime Watch. Despite massive media attention, appeals for information, appeals to police informers, and a £250,000 reward, for many months the investigation came up with nothing. And we can surely ask, was this because intelligence was being buried? Another clue that the investigation was being hindered is the claim that the telephone numbers given out on a subsequent Crime Watch appeal for information did not work properly. After 7 months, a decision which must have come from the very top of the Met was made to appoint Brian Moore as the senior investigating officer, that is, the investigation coordinator, and Hamish Campbell as the investigating officer, that is, the lead day-to-day investigator. They took over the case on the 6th of December 1999. Some of Brian Moore's history is covered in the book The Untouchables, which exposes police measures to try and address corruption within the Met Police. It seems from this that the police used corrupt police officers to fight police corruption. Worthy of note is Moore's role in the Ira Thomas case. I won't go into all of the details, but Ira Thomas was wrongly convicted of a shooting and spent 2 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The conviction came about largely because of evidence which was put together by Brian Moore and included 3 specks of firearm residue on a jacket belonging to the accused. One theory put forward at the time of Jill's murder was the possibility that a deranged fan may have killed her. Indeed, after a year of investigating and seemingly failing to come up with any promising leads, this theory became Moore and Campbell's main line of investigation when they focused their efforts on a man living half a mile away on Crookham Road called Barry George. He emerged as a suspect because apparently he was agitated that day, and at some point after the murder he asked people to verify his movements. He was initially considered a low priority suspect and was first interviewed on the 11th of April 2000. The piece of evidence that it seems was vital in getting him wrongly convicted, as mentioned earlier, was a tiny speck of gunpowder residue. Sound familiar? Found over a year after the murder in one of his coat pockets, despite the possibility that the particle could have come from a blank firing gun or even a firework. The coat wasn't delivered to the forensic service for 15 days after seizure, but was first sent to a police studio where it was photographed. Firearms had previously been photographed in the same studio. The forensic scientist, Robin Keeley, was the one who also analysed the coat in the Ira Thomas case. Also, police who searched his flat on multiple occasions had been equipped with firearms and searched his coat pockets, so the particle could have been deposited then. No further particles were found anywhere in his flat or on any of his other clothes, only the single tiny particle in a coat pocket. Significantly, neither of the two witnesses who actually saw the killer on Gowan Avenue identified Barry George as the killer. Only one witness, Jill's neighbour Susan Mays, who picked Barry George out of an identity parade over a year after the murder, placed Barry George anywhere near the murder scene. She saw a man fitting George's description and acting as though he did not want to be seen across the road from 29 Gowan Avenue at 7 a.m, which is 4.5 hours before the shooting. Barry George had a reasonable alibi, that he arrived at the Hafford Advice Centre at 11:50 a.m. and was wearing completely different clothes to the gunman. Therefore, he would not have had time to have gone home, get changed and get to the Hafford Advice Centre by 11:50. He should never have been put on trial. If it wasn't for the persistence of George and his supporters, he'd still be in prison today. We can surely ask, how the hell was George convicted in the first place? With an IQ of just 75, did Hamish Campbell see him as a soft target? Was he the perfect fall guy to enable them to close down their phony investigation? Hours after Barry George was found guilty, the BBC published an article about Campbell, praising him in the most extravagant terms. Hamish Campbell, high-flying Dando cop. Campbell has often been described as one of Scotland Yard's brightest stars, a high flyer who was promoted just months before the Dando killing and is now awaiting a superintendent posting. Campbell was promoted to detective superintendent straight after the Jill Dando case, and in 2003 he gained a further promotion to detective chief superintendent. He has been involved in a number of other high-profile cases, and in May 2011 was appointed Senior Investigating Officer for the Met Police's controversial review of Madeleine McCann's reported disappearance. Weeks later, he decided, no doubt with the approval of or orders from the very top, that the remit of the Madeleine McCann review was to investigate the abduction of Madeleine McCann, therefore ruling out any possibility that Madeleine had died. Hamish Campbell retired from the Met in May 2013. On the day he did so, he was still claiming that he had got the right man. In an Evening Standard headline, he was quoted as saying, "We did all we could to catch Jill Dando's killer, and we did it twice." Jill Dando did have numerous relationships prior to meeting Alan Farthing. Having read a few books about her private life, and having learned about a piece of evidence from the police investigation, which I will spare everyone's blushes by not mentioning, it is fair to say she was quite promiscuous. Some theories relate to this, that a jealous ex-boyfriend or an unknown lover had killed her, perhaps after learning about her engagement. I'm not aware of any direct evidence for this. A case of mistaken identity has also been put forward as a potential motive. Again, I'm not aware of any evidence to support this either. One person who was very close to Jill Dando, who mentioned in an interview the reason for Jill's death, is Toyah Willcox. Former pop star Willcox worked with Jill Dando on the Holiday programme, and they shared an office together at the BBC. Willcox said in one interview, "And I had a very, very bad experience when my work colleague Jill Dando was murdered. I was advised never to go to the same address at the same time for at least 3 months, and it took a long time to get over that." From that comment, it sounds like either the police or an intelligence agency has spoken to her or her agent. In another interview in 2002, when responding to a question about Jill's death, she said, "Death isn't the problem, it's the reason. I think death is actually a glorious thing. It's the reason this happened is so evil, and again that's made me incredibly angry that a very beautiful woman was wiped out and very publicly." This was a very curious statement. Why would Toyah Willcox claim to know the reason for Jill's murder? Who told her? Was she told about the reason by the same source that advised her never to go to the same address at the same time on different days? I was so curious about this, I decided to try and meet Toyah Willcox and discover what her reason was. So I booked a ticket to go and see her performing at a music festival in Stow-on-the-Wold in October 2017, in the hope I could speak to her afterwards. I'm in a place called Stow-on-the-Wold, and the reason why I've come here is because there's a pop concert on today. Toyah Willcox. I've got my ticket. I'm going to try and get to speak to her. I don't know whether I will be able to. The pop concert is called Up Close and Personal, so hopefully I'll get to speak to her. I suspect that she's been told a bogus reason. However, I would like to know what she's been told about that.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And it's called It's a Mystery. It's a mystery, oh it's a mystery. I'm so certain, oh it's a mystery to me. Sure.
I've just come out of the Toyah gig. Now after the gig they went off stage. I wasn't sure that she was going to come back, but she got changed and then she came back, and there was a few people hanging around wanting autographs and that kind of thing. So I waited my turn, and then when I spoke to her I said I'm researching and making a film about Jill Dando. She seemed interested. So I gave her the Madeline DVD box set, all the films, and I gave her the Peter Hyatt DVD and also my business card with my number on it, and I said it would be good to do an interview with you about Jill Dando. And I said I believe that I know the reason. I used her word, the reason, and straight away she said, is it to do with Serbia? Right? And I said, well, no, I don't think it is. So I suspect that when she's been quoted as saying that she knows the reason, that's what I think is in her head, or that's probably what she's been told. There was probably at least a dozen people listening to every word I was saying to her, right? And I didn't want to start getting into graphic detail about a very close friend that she had lost just after she's finished this quite nice concert that she's given, and all these people are there to see her singing. They're not really there to hear me asking her about a friend being murdered, right? So I didn't want to waste my chances of getting a potential interview with Toyah, right? So for that reason I didn't say, oh, when did you last see her? Why do you think she was murdered? I just kept it very brief. Hopefully she'll be intrigued and wonder what my reasoning is after she's watched the Madeline films. From this, it is quite clear to me that when Toyah refers to the reason, she is referring to the Serbian hitman theory. So let's come on to that one. The former Yugoslavia went through changes in the 1990s during a series of armed conflicts, resulting in it breaking up into separate states. In 1998, a war in Kosovo had started, which resulted in a humanitarian crisis. 3 weeks before Jill's death, she presented this appeal.
This Easter weekend, we've all become aware of the humanitarian crisis facing the Balkans as thousands of people from Kosovo have left their homes and arrived on the borders of neighbouring countries. This is a massive exodus. Around 600,000 people are on the move. These refugees have been walking for days. When they arrive, they're dehydrated, hungry, exhausted and cold, and yet there's nowhere to house them. The main countries they're fleeing to, Albania, Macedonia and the region of Montenegro, are poor and they can't cope with this mass influx. That's why the Disasters Emergency Committee is today launching an appeal on behalf of 12 leading UK aid agencies. They need your help to provide food and shelter to the refugees who have nowhere else to turn. The temperatures in the Balkans still drop to below freezing at night, and yet thousands of people are having to sleep outside. Keeping warm is virtually impossible. The refugees need shelter. Food is scarce. Children and old people are the least able to cope. Some are already losing the fight for life through sickness and exposure. And the aid agencies fear that disease will take hold if clean water and proper sanitation isn't provided quickly. Most aid agencies were already working in the former Yugoslavian region, and they were quickly in action. But to meet the massive demand of this humanitarian crisis, they need your help.
This article from the 28th of April states, police were last night still struggling to find anyone who wanted to harm Jill Dando. Detectives were even studying a suggestion that she was an innocent target for the revenge over the NATO bombing of Serbian TV studios last week. They said Jill may have been singled out as the face of British TV because she recently presented the high-profile humanitarian appeal to aid Kosovan refugees. This theory was further developed in the media on the 29th of April when it was claimed that the BBC head of news had received a death threat. The anonymous call, which named Tony Hall as a target, is being investigated by detectives hunting the killer of Jill Dando. One police source said the caller claimed to be a Serb seeking revenge for NATO's bombing of TV studios in Belgrade last week. Strange how the death threat came shortly after the theory was espoused in the media, not before. In my opinion, this all looks like it was concocted by someone running the cover-up as a convenient diversion. Remember, there were media stories wrongly suggesting the London nail bombings were carried out by a Serbian group as well. Perhaps this probably bogus motive was fed to Toyah Willcox and perhaps also to Nick Ross.